Constructive Criticism is sponsored by Oasis Games. MTGOasis.com is the place to get cards for your next Magic event. Try them out with code CCMTG for 15% off of your first order, and use the code WouldThatBeGood for 4% off of every order. Want to support the show directly? Head on over to patreon.com/CCMTG to check out some awesome benefits and future goals for the show. Thanks for listening, and here's this week's episode of Constructed Criticism.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 289th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your host, Mason, and I'm joined by my co-host, Trey McLarnon.
This is the sound of my voice.
You know, through the course of CC's life, there's always some reoccurring themes and jokes, and good to know that hasn't changed. This week, it's just me and Trey. Spencer is on dad duty. He's got to help take care of his kid, and he just actually got back from vacation. So I think his wife had made some plans to take care of some stuff since they didn't think they'd have time to do the podcast. So he's on dad duty, but that's okay. When Spencer's away, Modern's going to come in. To stay?
That rhyme was terrible, which I like. So good work.
Obi Trice.
No.
Well, let's jump right in.
I knew that was inevitable for this week, but I didn't know we were going to do it like in the intro.
Real name, no gimmicks. Real name, no gimmicks. Speaking of no gimmicks, let's talk about the point of the show, which is always improving. We really do think here, and I think it's true. It's not even like I think; it's kind of more of a statement that if you're not trying to improve and get better, you're going to get worse. And so every week on the show, we like to talk about some way that we've improved in life or in Magic. And Trey, I want to throw it to you first.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about sideboarding. Played the SCG Columbus this weekend. I played the GAC, which I'm sure surprises no one that listens to this show. But it came up a lot throughout the course of the day that, I think it's pretty common that people have heard, like, people like PV and other pros talk about that, like, if you're going to sideboard, you should take all 15 cards and shuffle them into your deck, and then you should take 15 cards out so that you're not revealing information to your opponent. And I've always been kind of the opinion that, yes, while that is probably the best way to do it, that the amount of information that you're leaking is normally pretty minimal. It's necessary to go through those steps for every match because it's not that big of an amount of information that you're giving away. That was particularly not true this weekend playing a graveyard-based deck like GAC, especially when there are such a variety of hate options that are available to combat it. And this was particularly true every Jund opponent that I played against, which I played against 4 times across the weekend. Which was definitely the deck that I played against the most. Because when we would go to sideboarding, after I played against Jund the first time, I just decided to not sideboard until they had decided what they were going to do. And I could just watch how many cards my opponent was pulling in, and then that let me know, do I need to bring in, like, Force of Vigor? Do I need to bring in Nature's Claims? Do I need to bring in these things? If they pull out, like, 3 cards and put them in, it's like, I can probably get by with just a couple of Assassin's Trophies, and I'm going to be okay. But if they brought in, like, 10 cards, then I probably need to bring in, like, more things to answer hate pieces because they're scared and they're going overboard. And so being able to, like, recognize that and being able to, like, utilize that information throughout the course of the day. And I mean, it was every time I played against it, every opponent did it that way and gave me just, like, loads of free information of how I was supposed to sideboard. And I was able to leverage that information throughout the course of the match.
Yeah, I think that's something that is really deck to deck. Like, I think that is really deck to deck. Like, I think there are some matchups where the 15 cards in really matters a lot more than others. Like, for example, if you're playing, like, the blue-white control mirror, it probably doesn't matter, right? Like, all that much, what Trey's talking about. But you're talking about something like with such specific cards and something like that, I can see that mattering a lot, too. And can we piggyback off yours a little bit here to a second part of it that I think you're probably going to get to, which is the over-sideboarding thing that happened a lot that we talked about this?
Yeah, this was a huge thing. It took 2 different forms. One was people mulliganing so aggressively to try to get to their hate piece. I had opponents mull to 3, mull to 4, because they were like, well, I've got a hand that's 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, but no hate piece, so I'm going to mulligan. And I'm just sitting there looking at my 7 cards being like, I don't really know if I could have beat that first hand that you mulliganed, like, as they're talking to me. And they're mulliganing so aggressively, they get to the point that they have a hate piece, but then their deck doesn't do anything. And so, yes, they were so scared of what was going on that they forgot that they also have to do something proactive in regards to their deck. The other thing that I saw was people, like, crazy amounts of over sideboarding. Like I played against a humans player who had Ariok Champions, Mirren Crusaders, Lavaz, Grafdigger's Cage, like all of that. Anafinza, like all of that for just the same matchup. And it's like, you're not going to get enough like spillover for that into other things. Like you're just dedicating way too much slots to that. And while this deck is very popular, this deck is very powerful, and you are going to see it a lot. Like I played against it one time in the mirror all weekend. I played against Jund 4 times. I played against Phoenix 3 times. If you're dedicating all of these slots and all of this stuff towards this one matchup, you're spewing tons of value. And, you know, I had it against another opponent, too, where I played against a Jund guy. And, Mason, you walked by at this game where he had... he had this game where he had... he had 2 Grafdigger's Cages in play, a Nihil Spellbomb in play, and
Leyline of the Void.
And a Leyline of the Void in play. And it's like, okay, yeah, after the first one, we all agree I can't use my graveyard. And... after the match, Mason walked away before it was over, and he goes, "Did you win the match?" I'm like, "Yes." He goes, "So you got game 3?" And I'm like, "No, I won that game." Because he drew a bunch of cards, and the game took a lot of turns, but like he just kept drawing more graveyard hate pieces because he sided in like 10. And, okay, great, you drew a bunch of them, but like they don't do anything. So I just eventually killed him with a Lotleth Troll that was like an 8/8.
Yeah, and I think this goes to something that, we kind of talked about on our car ride back here from the SCG and at dinner, and it was like, sideboarding with a purpose and having a plan when you're sideboarding, right? Like sideboard guides, essentially, right? If you're just, let's say you're the Jund player in the situation, right? And you're like, all right, I'm going to put in my 3 Leyline of the Voids and my 2 Nihil Spell Bombs and my cards, right? Well, if you don't have 10 cards that you can actually cut and it's going to make your deck worse, it's like a good amount of the time, Hogak can just kind of beat those draws. And it's not like Stony Silence, right? It's not like Stony Silence against Affinity where you play it and like, okay, their deck is just 1/1s. Like, you can beat that, right? And even then, sometimes you would fall for these tricks and just die to the 1/1s because you mulligan so much. But with Hogak, the deck is adaptive and can actually play out a fair enough game plan, and sometimes is able to beat certain hate pieces, right? Like Grafdigger's Cage doesn't stop them from delving. So if you have a Grafdigger's Cage in play, they can still cast the Hogak from their hand. Just the little things like that, and making sure your plans make sense is something that I think was something that I kept seeing reoccur when I was talking to Hogak players about their weekend. Was like, yeah, my opponent had all this hate, but like they didn't do anything, where they didn't utilize the hate correctly for their deck.
Yeah, and I have not seen a situation where my opponents were like playing from a position of fear since Splinter Twin. Like with this deck. Like, when you played Splinter Twin, your opponent always made plays like, well, I have to do this so I don't get Splinter Twinned. It's like they just always had to think about it every turn all the time. And like my opponents were like vocally telling me about mulliganing good hands and doing other things and making bad plays because they're like, well, I've got to bolt that Satyr Wayfinder so you can't Hogak me next turn. And it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe you do. I don't know. But that's a terrible value play throughout the course of the game. But like they're living in that fear constantly. And on the turns when that happens and you don't have it, God, it feels incredible. Like you just have so much more value that you're getting throughout the course of the game.
Yeah, and there's going to be a lot of Hogak.
You just have so much more value that you're getting throughout the course of the game.
Yeah, and there's going to be a lot of Hogak talk this week. If you listen to the podcast, you're going to hear a bunch of it. And we're going to talk about it later in the show for sure. But I think one thing, and we might get to this later more, is that you have to have a plan and know when you can afford to beat the Hogak draws and when you can't. There are games where you're not supposed to bolt the Wayfinder. If they have the GAC on 2, they have the GAC. And there are games where, you're going to have to bolt that Satyr Wayfinder on 2 because you're so far ahead otherwise, as long as they don't Hogak you. And, that is just something that people are still trying to figure out. And it's kind of a thing where, like, you have a new deck doing new things and people aren't quite sure. And there's all this, like, fear around the deck and frustration. So that's probably going to wrap up our Hogak talk for now. We'll get back to it later in the show, we promise. Yeah. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the GAC. It's back. My always improving moment this week was so spend a lot of time talking about the GAC. It's back. My always improving moment this week was so we talked about on the show kind of recently that like there are certain, like when I'm playing a deck I enjoy, I play much better than a deck I don't enjoy. So I also went to SCG Columbus and I couldn't get Hogak, and so I decided I was going to play humans a little bit ahead of time, and then kind of found out and figured out Hogak's good, couldn't get the cards for, and so I was like, all right, I'm going to play humans. And I wasn't super excited about my deck choice. I tweeted about like playing like a medium deck, and just my deck is fine, but it's not like particularly powerful, and it's probably like on the lower end of the powerful decks that you could be playing right now. And a lot of people told me too that they thought it was a terrible choice. And I started off the day 1-2, and I was like, okay, if I don't day 2 this open, I'm buying the cards for blue-white control at the open, and I'm playing blue-white tomorrow. To the point where, like, I sold the stuff I was going to sell and used it to buy, like, Jace the Mind Sculptors and stuff. Like, I was ready so that as soon as I was dead, I could run over to the vendors and take care of it. But I wasn't going to give up on the event because I had spent my money. I had picked this deck, and I had thought up good game plans and whatnot. And then I rattled off. I went from 1-2 to I didn't lose another round until round 13 of the open. I just rattled off a bunch of 2-0s in a row. And I should say, even if I didn't enjoy what I was doing so much, and even if my deck wasn't particularly well positioned in a matchup or in a game, I didn't let that, get the better of me, for lack of a better term. I played against blue-white control of my win-in for day 2. Now, it's very easy to buckle and be like, I just rattled off like 5 in a row. I just needed to win one more. I can't believe I got paired against this bad matchup. And then like you finish game 1, and then you have like a 13-man deck check, and it's like, I'm cooling off. I didn't allow that to affect me. I just kept playing, and I think that's something that I've personally. It's unacceptable that I can't play as good as I think I can if I don't enjoy the deck. And hearing Hayne mention that on his podcast recently, Table for Two, which is a great podcast with KYT and Hayne, where they just sit down and talk over coffee. And he talked about how when he was looking at players like PV and Siggy and whatnot, like. Maybe not them, but just like really, really great pro players. He's like, man, I feel like I'm really close to them. But the thing
that's great, and I think there was another thing that touched on, with your weekend in relation to that too, which is not overreacting to something not being well positioned in the metagame. Like with Modern specifically, like decks that have been the top deck at various points, right? Like Humans was the best deck in Modern for a while, right? And it didn't really lose any pieces. And so even though while it might not be the best metagame call right now, it's still a fundamentally powerful thing that it does. And its fail rate is almost non-existent, right? It's pretty low. Like you always get to play dudes and attack with dudes unless you just brick on lands. And so even having that like you might have a deck that's a top 10 deck, but it's not like the best deck you'd be playing at an event, but it still does fundamentally powerful things unless you're playing something that's just completely janky. And then not overreacting to that type of a situation, and you top 16 the event.
I top 30. I got 25th.
25th. I'm sorry.
Yeah. There was a moment where we thought I'd be playing win-in for top 8, and then
something that's just completely janky, and then not overreacting to that type of a situation, and you top 16 the event.
I top 30. I got 25th.
25th. I'm sorry.
Yeah. There was a moment where we thought I'd be playing win-in for top 8, and then my breakers weren't good enough, so I playing win-in for top 16, and then I lost that one to Bradley Carpenter on Wurza, which we'll talk about later in the show, which I think is a great name for the Grixis Urza deck and way easier to say. But yeah, also I don't want to spend. Actually, this kind of transition to what we're going to do next. We were going to talk about our weekend before we got into the mega rankings, which is going to be the training ground this week. I picked Humans because I thought it was a fine deck that is proactive, and I felt like if I played Humans and I played well, I was probably going to get like a min cash at worst. And then the Hogak thing started happening, and I found out that my Hogak matchup was okay, and it was probably good to decent if I played Leyline of the Void on my sideboard, but I didn't want to play Leyline of the Void. I was aware of Hogak on like Monday and Tuesday of last week, and then like kind of Thursday it kind of hit everyone once the deck list got published that, oh, this deck is still real. So people were scrambling to try and get the deck, right? And when people are scrambling to try and get the deck, not that many of them will actually have it, and you're going to play so many rounds. You're going to play 15 rounds at SCG if you do well, 18 if you do very well, right? And what are the odds I'm going to play against more than, 2 Hogaks in the Swiss? Not that much, so I didn't want to over-dedicate sideboard slots, because when I'm looking at it, it's like, well, I don't want to bring Leyline of the Void against anything except Hogak and weird graveyard combo decks, so I'm just not going to do that. And so I was okay with having points in other matchups and trying to basically attack the decks that were going to be there that you see from SCGs. And the second part to this, as I'm going to say, is people just don't want to buy Hogak. People don't want to spend the money on something like that that's just going to leave. And then furthermore, people feel like they can beat that with their deck they have, and they don't want to change. They're like, I like the way Black-White Tokens plays. I like that with their deck they have, and they don't want to change. They're like, I like the way Black-White Tokens plays. I like the way Tron plays. I like the way that Skelementals plays. I'm going to just do these little things instead of switching decks. Whether they should or they shouldn't, I'm not sure. But that's how I found a lot of people play. I'm on the Nova Discord, and I looked at their team deck list, and only one of them played Hogak. They all knew about Hogak. It's not like they all mentioned it in their sideboard guides. They all mentioned it in their stuff. But people just don't play the best deck a lot of the time for a myriad of reasons. So I'm always a little anxious to over sideboard if it isn't like Eldrazi winter times. And I think we're not, while we might be in that kind of format, I don't think we're at that point in the format's lifespan, if that makes sense. So that's kind of my reasoning for Humans. And Trey, why would you play a Hogak deck? That deck seems pretty medium. Playable, I would say, maybe.
I had a round this weekend where I had to mulligan to 5, and I kept a 1-lander. A round this weekend where I had to mulligan to 5, and I kept a 1-lander, and I missed my second land drop, and I put 18 power into play on turn 2. That's why I would play that deck.
Yeah, Hogak's pretty good. I guess we'll probably talk about that more, but yeah, I mean, you love graveyard decks, right?
I do love graveyard decks. I mean, it's one of those things that, like, you get that perfect storm, right, of, like, it's clearly the best deck in the format, and it is also the thing that, like, I fundamentally like to do in that format as well. Like, I just like playing graveyard decks in Modern. I don't necessarily, like, look to play graveyard decks in every format, but I do enjoy them. They break the system fundamentally of what zones are supposed to be utility, and this one breaks the system of what zones are supposed to be utility, and then also whether or not mana is necessary, and that combination is great. But the observation that I wanted to make, if we're just talking about our weekend in general, is that the idea of trying to metagame in a situation like this did well and all of that, but I just wanted to say in a broad stroke sense, I think that you touched on a key thing, that there are things about access to cards. And then there are things about a deck that goes so crazy powerful that people are just talking about it being banned before it's even being played. Or we saw that in Eldrazi Winter. We're seeing that now. And there is a thing that, like, people only have so much money to spend on Magic. And, like, they don't want to go buy cards that are, like, $25, $30 or whatever, that are just going to get banned. Or at least that they're scared that they're going to get banned. And then especially when you've got other things that pop up, right? Like, if you've got to look at spending that investment there or buying things like Wrenn and 6 because you want to play Jund. Like, people looking at an event like this, the one thing to always keep in mind is that if Phoenix is a reasonable choice or Jund is a reasonable choice, you will see that deck more than an alternate deck that is the quote-unquote best deck, because people love those two decks in a way that doesn't seem to translate to other things. I played against 4 Jund decks. 3 of them were foil. One of them was foil with Guru lands. Like, those people are about that life. Like, if there's an opportunity to play Jund where someone somewhere says Jund is a good deck and a reasonable choice, they're going to go grab those foil Goyfs and they're going to get in there.
I would like to say that I don't even think it's Jund. It's just decks in general, right? Like, Jund is like the stereotype one that, we all make jokes about, kind of like, just like we make jokes about Tron players, deservedly so. And there are just decks out there that people are like, it's Modern, I'm going to play my Emiria control deck, right? It doesn't matter if it's good or not, right? It's helpful when something like this is good, but, like, it's not like Is It Phoenix was particularly, it was like a good choice this weekend, but it wasn't the best choice in the world, but we saw Is It Phoenix everywhere, right? So, yeah, people are just going to play what they enjoy a lot of the time, and I think that's, on one hand, totally reasonable. On the other hand, something you need to think about when you're making these kind of decisions at things like SCGs, etc., and play what they enjoy a lot of the time. And I think that's, on one hand, totally reasonable. On the other hand, something you need to think about when you're making these kind of decisions at things like SCGs, etc., and to a lesser extent, GPs, back when they were a thing. So let's move on to the Mega Power Ranking, since that is the point of this week's show. This is the Power Ranking. This is the Modern Week episode. MCQ season starts. Yeah, MCQ started this week, and we are going into a crazy metagame. So we have the numbers from the Mythic Championship, the SCG Open, the SCG Classic, and the MTGO Modern Challenge. We actually didn't do the Modern PTQ on MTGO. We just we had made the list, and then we didn't see that, and it was getting close to the airtime. It was just like, that's fine. We have a lot of numbers. There was a lot of Hogak in the MTGO PTQ. That's what you need to know. So, one little thing to mention before we go any further, though, is normally we wouldn't put Mythic Championship points in here since Mythic Championships have a split format. This weekend, we have some honorable mentions. We had 2 decks come in just below the bar for 10th place with tied at 11 points each. We have Burn and Amulet. Now, I know you're a big Amulet guy. I'm going to take that from you, though, this week. I'm going to let you talk about Burn real quick. All right, I'm going to take your Amulet time.
Sure. I mean, one of the things with Burn is I think that it's a pretty reasonable choice as far as trying to battle Hogak. The Hogak deck is very fast, and it's very consistent, and it makes just giant dudes, which is not a good thing for Burn to have to deal with. But Hogak plays like one basic. I mean, they lightning bolt themselves like turn 1, turn 2, most turns. And that's a big help if you're the Burn player. Like, all of a sudden, it's not that much to try to ask for you to finish the game before you're going to die to the race of just them putting a ton of guys into play. I mean, the games are tight and the games are close, but, like, it is hard for the Hogak player to manage their mana resources and play things on time because they know they play. I mean, the games are tight and the games are close, but, like, it is hard for the Hogak player to manage their mana resources and play things on time because they know they have to race you because they're just completely playing into what it is that you're trying to do. And I think that that's something that, like, is in favor of Burn, you know, when looking at what the metagame is, other than the fact that it's also just, like, really consistent and does its thing all the time and you always get to play all your cards.
Yeah, there are two big things that I think about Burn. I love what you said. These are just the two things I thought of that weren't mentioned. One, Eidolon on the play is really good against Hogak. Normally all their spells are Superman efficient except for the GAC. So you're going to get like 2 to 4 points easily off that card. And the second is a lot of creatures say can't block. You know? They just literally can't block. So your Goblin guy draws, while they eventually do get stopped by the Hogak, do create an interesting dynamic where they can't swing back and kill you. It can be awkward for them to swing full force because you get attacked back, even though they have all these bodies. So Hogak do create an interesting dynamic where they can't swing back and kill you. It can be awkward for them to swing full force because you get attacked back, even though they have all these bodies. So Burn, a completely reasonable choice. It's hard for Burn to be a utterly garbage choice, I think, in Modern just in general. But Burn, I think, is totally fine there.
Then the other deck that you were talking about, Amulet. I mean, this is a thing that a crazy person would do, right? You're playing a 6-drop in Modern. Why would you ever spend 6 mana to do anything in Modern?
Well, you see, the Ravnica bounce lands kind of help, makes it like 4 mana.
Oh.
So Amulet is a deck that I've played a lot of and I like a lot of. And actually, I like a lot about Amulet, I should say. And actually, if you went to the Patreon and you looked at our my Modern Breakdown article I wrote, I actually put Amulet as a trap tier. I think the deck is too slow, while consistent and powerful, it's just too slow against the GAC, even with Dilk's innovation of, well, I should say GAC said you played up to this point, and we were in round 14, and he said I played against 1. So it's just another example of, like, listen, you're not going to play against all these decks all the time, and these decks are still powerful, it's just harder for them to exist in the world of the Hogak. And as Hogak takes up more and more of the metagame and assimilates it as it probably will, it becomes more and more unreasonable to play Amulet Titan. So I don't know. There's some things I like about Amulet Titan in these top 10 decks we're going to talk about, but I think for the most part it's a trap. And as soon as it's good, I'll be back on my crazy person horse. But for right now, I don't know. I think you have to be a master. I think you have to be like Dilks or Edgar or one of them to play it right now. And I don't think that's always the case. So,
well, what is it then that we're looking at as far as the top 10s?
Yeah, so let's start off with number 10, coming in with 13 points. This is Blue-White Control. This is a deck that Trey hates in Modern. Trey, we probably before going further, how do you feel about Blue-White Control? This is a deck that Trey hates in Modern. Trey, we probably before going further, how do you feel about Blue-White Control even being in the top 10? Do you think that's reasonable considering everything that's going on?
I do think that it's reasonable considering everything that's going on. I mean, I'm still of the position that this is a format where I would much rather be proactive than reactive. But if you're going to be reactive, this is the deck where it is. You know, you have the hard tools to combat the graveyard nonsense. You have Rest in Peace. You have Celestial Purge. You have Path to Exile. You have lots of things that are useful in that regard. And it's weird. I actually think that the existence of Hogak is a benefit to Blue-White Control. Because one of the problems that you always have with Control in something like Modern is that the metagames are so varied and so big, and there's so many different angles of attack that it's hard to be able to line up the answers for everything. But if you have a deck like Hogak that constricts the metagame, and it makes it where there's less viable decks and there's less things that people can be doing, and it becomes a different type of environment where you only have to try. and it becomes a different type of environment when you only have to try to focus on a smaller number of decks, then that increases the possibility of Control being good.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. I think the same thing can be said about Jund, which we'll get to later in the list, spoilers. When metagames narrow, decks that are trying to pick apart certain things and attack certain types of strategies improve. Duh. And I think Blue-White Control has got a lot of powerful cards from War of the Spark. We talked about this over the last 3 months a little bit, but Narset is a huge addition to the deck. Little Teferi is quite good in a lot of matchups that aren't the GAC, and it's still serviceable-ish in the GAC matchup if you can pick apart their board. And we just can't forget how good Path Snap Path is. It's kind of like Bolt Snap Bolt against normal creature decks. Path Snap Path against Hogak is very powerful. We talked about them only having one basic. After the first path, it's basically just poof, obliterate their thing. It's gone.
Yeah,
so,
and same thing with Field of Ruin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Field of Ruin also very good for that. It can so much harder. I just think Blue-White Control has the tools to beat Hogak, but probably not consistently enough. And that's kind of the one downside of Blue-White Control, I think, right now, is that while the games play out pretty similarly from the GAC side, you have to draw the right half of your deck, and they can still do things on turn 2, which is a little bit too fast for you on occasion.
Yeah, I think that that's true. But what about the number 9 deck here? We've got Old School Dredge, no Hogak, coming in at 15 points. And is that something that surprises you in this regard at all?
Well, do we know that I believe some Dredge decks do play the GAC?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen varied things. I mean, I've seen 1, and then I've seen some lists that have been full 4. But, a lot of the lists I have seen are not focused on the GAC, primarily, but they are adding it in. But this is still going to have your traditional Dredge cards, like Prized Amalgam, Creeping Chill, Conflagrate, Life from the Loam, all of those kinds of things going on.
Yeah, I think Dredge is a completely reasonable deck, kind of like Humans in a similar way. My main problem with Dredge right now is while it's powerful and probably more consistent than Hogak, it isn't as powerful, and Hogak is still very consistent in what it does. It's not like the deck's inconsistent, which leads me to think that Dredge might not be the best choice, but it's still like a fine choice. And it could be that, just with the way metagame breaks down, that you need to be on a Dredge style thing that can do some more medium draws. I don't know exactly, it kind of just depends on how things evolve, but I think Dredge is fine. I think it's scary that there can be this much graveyard hate and Dredge still perform and still be picked.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tools for Dredge right now, and it shows that there's even different directions that you can have success with, but there's a key word in there that you said that I think that it establishes the difference between where this is and where Hogak is. Dredge is a very reasonable deck, which is insane to say because Dredge is fundamentally an unreasonable deck. But in the face of Hogak, it's reasonable in comparison to what Hogak is doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really realize that when I was saying it. Also, it's probably worth noting that I think Dredge I think it's probably better against the Jund and the blue-white decks than Hogak is. While Hogak can beat those decks and overwhelm them, they can only really overwhelm them. So if they don't have those blazing fast draws, decks like blue-white can snap past snap Hogak and take over the game. They can Supreme Verdict by that time, use their Teferis and their Jaces to actually win. Where against Dredge, they can do things like Loop Loam and Blood Gas and then conflagrate you out of the game.
Yeah, and the Creeping Shields are a real deal in that regard. Like, having that ability to have that kind of reach from Dredge, is the thing that, would be a big draw of looking in that direction versus looking at the other.
I agree 100%. Do you have anything else you want to say on Dredge? You play a lot more Dredge than I do, so I don't have a whole lot to say.
I can't believe I'm going to say this, but no, not really.
Yeah, Dredge is good. It's fine, and I think we're going to see a lot of Dredge if Hogak gets banned. But until then, I need Dredge to do something to change its game plan and adapt to the metagame. And I'm not sure if adding the GAC is enough, but I just don't see the reason in my mind's eye perfectly as to why to play that deck over the GAC.
Yeah,
on average.
Same.
All right, well, next up we have Mono Red Phoenix coming in at 18 points at 8th place. Mono Red Phoenix is a deck I think is pretty great right now. I like it a little bit more than Burn, while a little bit less consistent, has that bigger power draw. And I think it also does a better job of taking advantage of Hogak's I think it also does a better job of taking advantage of Hogak's inability to really block, and then it can fly over the top with Arclight Phoenixes, and just has a lot of burn spells. Trey, what do you think about Arclight Red?
I like it, and it's a thing that, I know that there's always been a preference between this, even particularly for me, of favoring Izzet Phoenix over Mono Red Phoenix. And I think the situations that you run into of when I would prefer Mono Red Phoenix over that is in the place where, like, going fast is preferential, right? Because this deck goes faster, burns faster, does more damage faster than the Izzet Phoenix deck most of the time. And I think that, that's a reasonable plan in trying to attack what it is that's going on in the arms race at the top of the metagame.
Yeah, I agree. It's also interesting because while I don't think it's as consistent as Burn, I think it goes a little better, a little longer than Burn does in some ways. Well, Burn has the inevitability that, like, eventually there's a critical mass of deal X spells, so you hit that 4-3 life point, and from that point on, they're under constant pressure. This deck, if they stabilize at a higher life total, you're able to actually kind of crawl back out of, thanks to Arclight Phoenix and Bedlam Reveler being in the deck.
Yeah, I like the deck. I think that there's a lot of reasons to like it. It always comes down to the preference choice of, like, whether or not Thing in the Ice is something that you want or not when looking between those two decks.
Mm-hmm. Well, you see, you thought this might be over, Trey, but you're wrong, because Zan Syed played Gruul Phoenix, which is very similar to Mono Red Phoenix, except it just has Ren and 6. What do you think about this? This deck is too cool to not talk about in this section. It's basically just, we think I haven't heard their reasoning, but it seems to me that it's that we think the Canopy lands are that good in this deck. This thing is a pinger, so it's able to control the board and at least go face sometimes. And getting 2 draws a turn is enough for us to put a couple Stomping Grounds in our deck.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I don't think about fighting the Jund decks of, like, wanting to grind longer and having the ability to grind longer and combat that in some way. Drawing extra cards is always good, and if you can get to the point that you're, like, giving your Lightning Bolts retrace, that's probably good.
They also played Seasoned Pyromancer in the main deck, I believe.
Oh, that I like.
Yeah, so they're a little bit slower. I believe Seasoned Pyromancer took the place of Bedlam Reveler, and I think Ren 6 takes the place of another generic burn spell that's not great. Or maybe it was some of the light up the stage and some of the burn spells. I can't quite remember off the top of my head. But either way, I think the deck's very interesting, and it's something we actually talked about a long time ago back on Even Odds, is, like, there's a lot we can do with Phoenix, there's a lot we can do with splashing that we just haven't quite tried yet, because we very quickly found these super efficient builds to the deck, even in Mono Red Phoenix, and it can be a little, don't fix what isn't broken, It's like, these decks are fine, they consistently perform, why change? Found these super efficient builds to the deck, even in Mono Red Phoenix, and it can be a little, don't fix what isn't broken, It's like, these decks are fine, they consistently perform, why change too much? And Zan is always willing to kind of push the boundary. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to explore. I don't know whether or not it's worth it, but it might be. I mean, I think I can certainly see reasoning as to why it's something that's worth going down the rabbit hole for.
Yeah, for sure. Also, Mono Red Phoenix, it's one of those decks, kind of like Titan Shift, I feel, where, like, it's been doing very well, but people just don't talk about it. Like, if you look at the SUG results, every weekend there's always a Arclight Red in, like, the top 8 of a Classic, normally multiples. And while Classics, are smaller events than Opens, it's still interesting when you see a deck appear and appear and appear and appear. So it's probably something to that when you see that a bunch.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, number 7
in the metagame, like, what Tron does is fundamentally powerful. And that, like, you have access to that kind of a thing that cheats the system on mana and does really over-the-top powerful things. Those things are, like, generically good. And I think that's something that can also benefit from the fact that people are targeting their hate away from this that was at one time, like, a boogeyman of the format. That, if the hate that's there to try to target the other deck, try to target Hogak or any of that kind of thing, doesn't really affect Tron, doesn't really have any impact on it. And if you're having people that are over sideboarding and over focusing on that kind of thing, then you can do powerful stuff. I
agree with that. Also worth noting, both Dom and I'm blanking on their name. They're our MC champion, the Arena Boy from Channel Fireball. They both cut Karn the Great Creator from their decks. So they both had more real sideboard cards, doing more impactful things during matchups and not losing their name. They're our MC champion, the Arena Boy from Channel Fireball. They both cut Karn the Great Creator from their decks. So they both had more real sideboard cards doing more impactful things during matchups and not losing that access to that, which those other sideboard cards that Karn couldn't get, things like more like Nature's Claims and Spatial Contortions. Having access to this kind of cards, I think, is pretty relevant. And I think this deck also kind of speaks to the fact that I talked about earlier in the show, where some people just won't switch decks. And they were going to play these decks to think that will beat Hogak as well. And Tron does a really good job of beating that. Because if you don't try and beat Tron, you don't try and be proactive, then Tron's going to beat you. And it's really hard to be more proactive than Hogak. So by default, people try to go, instead of going a half a step slower than Hogak, they go like a full step slower than Hogak, right? Which then Tron's like, cool, I'm the slowest but the fastest at the same time. Watch me just crush you in the ground with Karns and Ulamogs, etc. I'm not super surprised to see Tron win once it makes the top 8 of these kind of events. I just don't have the guts to pull the trigger on Tron. I heard Dom played like a master in the finals of the Open. I unfortunately haven't got to see that yet. And I'm very interested to hear more about his thought process for picking Tron specifically going this weekend. Because honestly, to me, it seems like when Hogak's so big and popular, it can be kind of risky to pick a deck like Tron.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't do it, but I can see how you end up there. It's just, and I mean, we all know people like this, right? Like, we know people that are just going to play Tron no matter what, right?
Yeah, but Dom isn't that.
But Dom isn't that.
Yeah, like, the Arena Boy person, I'm sorry, I still can't remember their name. I'm trying to look it up at the moment. It's so hard to find information on my MC champ, by the way. Just a random aside here. Yeah, so besides the fact it's so hard to find the MC champ's information, Dom here, has some concessions to Hogak with 3 relic in deck. You might see normally like 2 or 1 of that card. So there are some things being happened still with the GAC. But honestly, it's very impressive, and it just kind of shows like this confidence in play skill and confidence in knowing what's going to happen in a metagame, I think, to pick Tron and play it.
Yeah, I do think that it's a thing wanting to go, that moving away from a wish board to open you up to more sideboard possibilities is something that I think is appropriate. Mm-hmm. Because of the pressures that puts on your ability to answer varied things while you're doing like very powerful things like, locking people out of the game and things like that. Tron already does fundamentally powerful stuff, and you need to be able to interact with the things that are going on from the other side.
I agree with that a lot, and Tron's just going to do Tron things. You know what else is fundamentally powerful, Trey? Our sponsor at Oasis Games. Trey, let's do that ad.
Sure thing. Hello, fellow Magic competitor. If you're like me, and I think you are, then you have heard the murmuring of the invasion of our beloved modern format. An invasion by an entire undead city. Of course, I'm talking about the unstoppable force, Hogak Arisen Necropolis. You may be asking yourself, what can be done in the face of such a menace? But I, for one, welcome our new GAC overlord. I want to remind them that as a trusted podcast personality, I can be quite useful in recruiting others to the cause. I'll show you. Dear listener, I know that you've been grinding away, toiling on this lonely rock, working your calloused hands looking for meaning, for purpose, for community, for acceptance. Look no longer. You will be embraced in the Arisen Necropolis. You will be whole in the Arisen Necropolis. I am Hogak. You are Hogak. We are Hogak. And we all rise together. So head on over to mtgoasis.com and prepare yourself from the upcoming joining. Use code CCMTG for 15% off your first order, and then you could use code WouldThatBeGood for 4% off every order.
Wow, that's so good. What better way to usher us into our top 5 decks from Modern from this past weekend? Let's start off right with number 5. We've alluded to it earlier in the show.
We have skipped number 6.
We have skipped number 6. You're right. I didn't want to skip number 6. That was a moment in my life.
That's okay.
Urza is number 6 in the top 10 decks here. Trey, I think you and I are both of the opinion before Urza decks were probably going to be good once they were figured out. I got to talk to Harlan Fear of Team Nova this past weekend a little bit, and he was saying he thinks Urza's busted. He thinks the deck's really good. They just haven't found the right version yet. And when someone has back-to-back open top 8s, but at the time when you're talking about this, it was Saturday before. He's going to get his 3rd open top 8 the next day in a row playing this deck. And they're like, yeah, our deck's really good. Also, we don't have the best version by like a good amount yet. It's like, whoa, okay, these people are like super aware and it's still just crushing. That's kind of scary. And then he got another top 8 12 hours later from the time of that conversation, or 24 hours later, it's just kind of insane. I think the Wurza decks are really, really strong. They're pretty good against Hogak. They're really consistent. They can adapt to metagames. And I think when the GAC's gone, it and Ren and 6 are going to really rise up, like the Necropolis is right now.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Ren and 6 are going to really rise up, like the Necropolis is right now.
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, I got to watch your match against Brad Carpenter, and it's surprising to me how consistent this deck seems to be for a deck that I think has some mana issues and some other things and maybe some weird card choices that haven't been figured out. It still was able to assemble its combo pretty successfully and in the face of pretty heavy aggression from you as the humans player.
Yeah, I definitely did not have a slow start in game 2. I definitely put the pedal to the metal there. The Wurza decks also have made some interesting adaptations and figured out some pretty cool tech to fix these exact problems, like playing cards like Chromatic Star, so they can fix their mana and cantrip through the deck, try to find that combo and set it up, I think is a very smart innovation to the deck. And I don't know, I think there's still a good amount of work to be done, but these Wurza decks look so good. I am highly concerned for my MCQ this weekend, so.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing, right? I mean, you and I both liked KCI when KCI was a thing, and, these decks are the heir apparent, it seems like, of that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not as egregious as KCI, and luckily it wins the game instantly, so it's not like KCI where you have to sit there for a long time. But this deck might reach, it might become that artifact deck as soon as the Hogak's gone. And it also seems to have a very good Hogak matchup, I lost to Harlan's team at SUG Pittsburgh playing for top 8 when it was the crazy Hogak weekend, and it was the Bridge from Below was still around, and they registered it then, where it could combo kill you through what the deck's doing. And then now, right, they don't have that combo kill, and they're still registering this deck because it's even though that deck can play a real game plan now, of just casting creatures and attacking us, we can beat that so easily with Thopter Foundry, with our Ensnaring Bridges, with our main deck Graph Digger's Cages, against Bradley Carpenter game plan now, of just casting creatures and attacking us, we can beat that so easily with Thopter Foundry, with our Ensnaring Bridges, with our main deck Graph Digger's Cages, against Bradley Carpenter, he won the dice roll, went first, and looked at his hand, thought for a second, kept, and then played turn 1 Graph Digger's Cage. Because his deck just gets to do that sometimes. And if I was a Hogak player, it's just, I'm what do I do game 1? It's so hard to beat that. So, I think this deck has a lot of options, a lot of power, and I think that Graph Digger's Cage example can be taken to other decks in other formats when we don't need to have Graph Digger's Cage main deck.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but because that deck relies so much on just sacking their artifacts for value anyway, if you play some kind of cheap utility artifact that's really powerful in certain matchups, when it's not there, it's I just get to sack it and use it to bring my other stuff back that I've tutored with my Goblin.
Yep, exactly. And they've played Tormund Crypt's main deck for a very similar reason, so enable the Mox Opal draws too, right?
Right.
A lot of smart things happening there.
Yep.
Yeah, we're seeing some smart people really work hard in this deck and really do a lot with this deck, and it's exciting stuff. Number 5 is Jund.
Yeah, it's Jund. I mean, it's everywhere, and like I said, it was my most played against deck across the weekend, and this deck is very good. Ren and 6 is a huge addition to this deck. But yeah, it's something that I think really has made things interesting. I mean, I had an opponent had Baronmore in his deck, and he was just recurring it every turn and drawing extra cards, and while moving towards his ultimate on his Planeswalker. It's that stuff's very powerful when you're dealing with these value-based things, and that, Tarmogoyf does hit hard still. That's not a thing that has really gone away. And so I think that these decks are here to stay, and if you're the kind of person that likes mid-range stuff going on, this is a good place to be.
I think Jund is very good right now.
Yeah.
It can beat Hogak. I think
this is a good place to be.
I think Jund is very good right now.
Yeah.
It can beat Hogak. I think currently there's too much going on in the sideboard. There's too much not focused plans from some players, and that's leading to Hogak being able to sneak out those wins along with winning game 1. But I think it can beat that deck. You can just grind them into the dust. Maybe it doesn't play out like that, but in theory that's how it seems to play out, and it seems very reasonable. Plus, Jund just can beat these other decks that we're talking about on our list. Of the decks we already talked about already, Jund beats up on blue-white. It reasonably beats up on Mono Red Phoenix. And now, thanks to Ren and 6, you can choose to beat up on Tron if you want to. You know, before Tron would beat up on you, but if you were willing to go down the Ghost Quarter route or something like that, you can beat up on these Tron decks. Not saying you should, but it's something where Jund can adapt and attack to these decks. So, not to mention, Jund is just so good at tearing decks apart that if you're playing a deck that isn't tuned, isn't
much yet, is that, you know, it plays black, which means it can play Plague Engineer out of the side. And Plague Engineer is a very powerful sideboard card right now. It's very good against Hogak. It's very good against humans. It's good against some of the other random stuff that pops up. You know, like you played against that black-red Skelemental guy. The Plague Engineer is insane against that deck.
Yeah, Plague Engineer is insane against both their decks, humans and that one. You know what? I'm just going to say this. The rest of the top 5 list, I think, at least once it's post-board, Jund has a good matchup against all of them. And I know when I was listening to Nick's earlier, I didn't want to spoil the list, so I had to kind of hobble it together. But I just think going forward, I think Jund has a good matchup against all of these, at least post-board, if you have the plans to attack them. So Jund seems totally reasonable to me. I don't have much more to say on it. There's a lot of Jund talk out there. A lot of people are playing Jund, so. Yeah,
and I think the deck's good and it's very powerful and a very defendable choice for any tournament that's upcoming.
Should we talk about Ronin $60? I guess before.
Yeah, and I think the deck's good and it's very powerful and a very defendable choice for any tournament that's upcoming.
Should we talk about Ronin $60? I guess before we move on real quick.
Ren and $60.
Yeah, that's like a cheap Ren, right?
Yeah, what a bargain.
I think that card's better than Bob. I'll just say that right now. In the deck, like when the deck's built with it in mind, I think that card is better than Dark Confidant. I think being able to control the battlefield is important. I think actually winning the game at a certain point, because retracing your spells will do that. If you just have retrace on all your spells, you'll figure out a way to win. And I think that not being a creature is also super important.
I agree with all of those things, especially that part when you said utilizing your graveyard will make you win the game.
Oh, you like the graveyard, I see.
No.
Number 4. That's what I said. I didn't say number 5 again. It hasn't been a long weekend. Number 4, humans. 35 points. Anyone that would play humans is probably 35 points. Anyone that would play humans is probably devilishly good looking and smart and handsome and probably shouldn't have picked that deck for this week.
Yeah. I mean, this is one, I mean, we already talked about this a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but humans, like I said, it does what it does very effectively. It's very good tribal synergies and attacks and puts a clock on people, and it has disruptive elements and can surprisingly interact with and disrupt Hogak more than it seems like it should when you just look at the two decks. But, if you have experience playing the matchup, you can name Meddling Mage and name trouble cards at opportune times to give you enough time to kill them. I don't know that it's the best position deck overall. I'm a little surprised that it was as high on the list, but I think it just goes down to, it just does its thing every time over and over again.
Yeah, I agree with how... I will say this. Humans is really refined. I think you kind of alluded to that earlier, too. And having a deck that is well-built and well-tuned and very consistent and good at what it does and able to adapt is a powerful thing to be doing in Modern. It's not like Humans is terrible. I don't think Humans is a terrible deck. I just don't think it's the best position deck of all the decks that I would consider a top tier deck. I think it's the lowest on the totem pole. But being the lowest, the lowest totem pole thing of the best things you can be doing is still reasonable.
Yeah. But to give it an idea, separate from just the ranking of how the finishes went, I don't know that I would play Humans over Jund or Wurza, but I would probably play Humans over Tron if I were looking at making a pick of a deck.
Oh, interesting. I think those two are kind of relatively close.
Yeah, and then that comes down to a preference. I don't
Sure.
particularly enjoy playing Tron.
Sure, that's
I don't
Sure.
particularly enjoy playing Tron.
Sure, that's fair. I don't particularly enjoy playing Humans, but I did anyways.
Fair. But what about the number 3 deck? Do you enjoy flipping Thing in the Ice in your Is It Phoenix deck?
Yeah, Is It Phoenix came at number 3 with 38 points. Is It Phoenix? It's interesting. When the deck was a Bridgevine deck, more so than just a GAC deck, it could combo mill people out. A lot of people, including myself, played Is It Phoenix at SCG Pittsburgh which was the one or two modern tournaments in real life that actually had the GAC. I can't quite remember how many there were. And we just saw a bunch of people play Phoenix as a way to kind of attack the GAC. And I figured is that Phoenix would be coming back and would be able to kind of do the same role, right? And I'm curious because I'm going to talk about this for a second here. Number 2 is Eldrazi-Tron. I wonder if people I wonder if people also suspected that and figured out Eldrazi-Tron is good against Hogak because it has Bridge, a Fast Clock Disruption, and Chalice of the Void, and Chalice of the Void is very good against Hogak. And the increase of Chalices led to Phoenix not doing as well. And then also the good amount of Tron being there. Tron was traditionally a hard matchup for Phoenix. So now you have these two different Tron decks attacking Phoenix. And I wonder if people are just predicting that or just by its happenstance Phoenix didn't perform as well as I thought it would. That being said, it's number 3 on our list. It still did really well. I just kind of expected it to be number 2. So it's just surprising.
Yeah, and I mean, it was close. I mean, Eldrazi-Tron's 43 points and Phoenix is 38. Like, it wasn't like a huge difference as far as what the numbers are between them. This deck is the same kind of thing, right? It's fundamentally powerful. It does what it does. And I think that it's going to continue to be a top 5 deck in Modern for the time that it's in Modern.
Yeah. I agree with that a lot. Ooh, here's the thing about Phoenix to me. Is it so consistent? And I know I've said this so many times on the show, so I just almost didn't say it there as well. But it just always gets to play its game. And that be the best. Always getting to play. Having access to go wide strategies in the form of Thing in the Ice, I think is very powerful. Being able to beat strategies that lock you off the ground by using Pyromancer's Decision or Aria Flame, depending on where you fall in those camps, I think is very powerful. Is it Phoenix is just good? I think it's going to be just a totally good deck for a long, long, long time.
Yeah, I agree. Now, one that has not always necessarily been a great deck for the whole time that it's been around, but has risen up as a result of where we are in the metagame, Eldrazi-Tron.
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned it a second ago with Is It Phoenix. Eldrazi-Tron has Chalice, which is good against Hogak. It has Bridge, which is good against Hogak. It has a Fast Disruption. You can go turn 2 Thought-Knot Seer, take a GAC, take their Lightning Axe, whatever that might be, slow down your Thought-Knot Seer, play your Reality Smashers, and apply a lot of quick pressure, while also kind of being a slightly bigger deck, so you're able to tussle with some of the other decks we've talked about here.
It puts a clock on you. Chalice is very good against, I think, all of the top decks. And Bridge is also something that's very powerful on the things that are trying to attack you. And I think that the draw of those cards is kind of the bigger draw than the spaghettis themselves.
Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable. I am still I think Eldrazi-Tron's a good deck right now. I'm unsure if it was the right deck to play. I almost wonder if it was more the hard lock min cash than Humans was. You know what I mean? I wonder if it was it was the Humans for this weekend when it comes to Clock plus Disruption. You know what I mean?
Right.
Maybe not the deck that's going to win the tournament, but it's going to do pretty well. Although there were a couple of close calls, a couple people. We saw Dylan Hand get, I believe, 11th at the Open, playing a winning in and losing it for top 8. So Eldrazi-Tron, definitely a real player in the metagame. Definitely powerful and proactive. Interesting to see it this high. Eldrazi-Tron, definitely a real player in the metagame. Definitely powerful and proactive. Interesting to see it this high. And the addition to Karn the Great Creator cannot be understated for this deck.
Yeah, for sure. And I know I said that I didn't really think the spaghettis were all that relevant, but Thought-Knot Seer specifically is big. The fact that it exiles, particularly one of the best decks, a graveyard deck, it's a big game.
Yeah. Huge game. Also, probably worth mentioning is that Ensnaring Bridge, because of Karn Great the Creator, is very big, and Karn Great Creator plays out like Karn 7 used to in that deck, where you go 4+3 a lot, whether it's Tranosphere, Liquid Metal Coating, or Ensnaring Bridge. And before, we used to talk about how the 7 was so awkward in the deck because you wanted a powerful card when you had your Tron hits or to go in the later game, but it costs so much mana. And now you have the new Karn, which gives you some weird utility against some decks like Wurza, right? But also lets you play out powerful, letting your Tron hits or to go in the later game, but it costs so much mana. And now you have the new Karn, which gives you some weird utility against some decks like Wurza, right? But also lets you play out powerful, like letting you have powerful plays like the other Karn, but you break it up into 2 chunks so it's playable in the early game, letting you pay over 2 turns, which we've always found to be more mana efficient. Even if it's not as powerful.
Yeah, I think that's all reasonable.
All right, coming in at 120 points is Hogak.
Have we ever seen a gap this big on the power rankings?
Honestly, I don't even think Eldrazi
winner.
Eldrazi winner at the PT was this big of a gap. Although I think the secret wasn't quite as out then, and there weren't as many events. But yeah, I mean, you have to take 5th through 2nd before you get more points than GAC. Like 2, 3, and 4 combined do not equal the GAC on points when it comes to representation of decks. Hogak is
the deck's insane, and this is something that I told you across the weekend that you were first incredulous about, but it's quite possibly the most egregious deck I've ever played in Magic.
I just asked, are you sure?
I know, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's pretty close. I mean, the only things that I can think of that come close as far as being egregious were Mono Blue Show and Tell when Dig Through Time was legal. That deck was insane. And then the Eldrazi deck during Eldrazi Winter. But the numbers for this are outrageous. Like, to give you an idea for reference, like during Eldrazi Winter, the Eldrazi deck was 33% of all decks that had 8 or more wins at all tournaments what it was legal for. Hogak had 45% of all decks that had 8 or more wins. Like, that's outrageous.
Even some like self-hate trying to keep each other down, and we're still seeing this.
Right. Yeah, and I mean the number of times that like I had opponents play Rest in Peace or Leyline or something else like that against me, and I just didn't care. It's like, fine. Like, yeah. So you still get to play a fairly like effective game, especially if they have had to mulligan aggressively in order to try to get there. And the deck is preposterous. It does just things that are insane. Like, you'll have a hand that's like Stitcher Supplier, Satyr Wayfinder, Faithless Looting, and 4 lands, and you would like snap it off because you're going to draw like 8 cards across the first 2 turns and probably still just win.
Yeah, you see a lot of cards, a lot of card selection, where looks, maybe is a better way to say that. What do you think about the statement that the banning of Bridge made this a better deck because now it is less reliant on the graveyard at times? Like being able to actually cast your Vengevines.
Yeah, I think that it
reliant on the graveyard at times. Like being able to actually cast your Vengevines.
Yeah, I think that it makes it more resilient to the hate, honestly, because it's focusing on like interacting with the combat step. It's less explosive in the sense that it doesn't like kill you on turn 2. It like kills you on turn 3 or turn 4 instead of killing you on turn 2. Yeah, I know. And so it loses that angle. It's weird because it makes it better against graveyard hate and worse against ensnaring bridge.
Yeah, much worse against ensnaring bridge.
Right? But it is. I mean, like, whatever. You can just play a reasonable plan. And, like, things like the addition of Lotleth Troll, things like, I think, playing Crypt Breaker over Insolent Neonate, like, make it where you can play against the graveyard hate more effectively and more consistently. And as a result of that, like, it's good, especially when everybody's overloading on that hate. It does make you worse in other situations and make you a little bit less explosive, but by like a turn, and that's not that big of a deal when you're talking about between turn 2 and turn 3.
Yeah, that is true. I agree with all that. I agree with what's been said. Trey, we talked a lot about Hogak just because it's, shaping the metagame. We talked about it in passing. Is there anything you want to say to people before we move off the GAC?
I'm just going to tell a story. Okay. From what happened this weekend. I told the story about putting 18 power into play on turn 2 with only 1 land, just as a quick idea of how that happened if you're not familiar with the deck. I played Stitcher Supplier on turn 1. I played Stitcher Supplier on turn 2. I cast Hogak and recurred 2 Vengevines.
Yep.
And then I killed my opponent, and afterwards he said, "What do you think is going to happen? Do you think that they're going to ban something, or do you think this is reasonable?" And my response was, "You were here for that game, right? Like, you saw what happened. Like, there's nothing reasonable about what's occurring in regards to this deck. Like, there's no deck that I have ever played that feels less like you're actually playing Magic and just doing something that's completely different than what everybody else is doing than what this is." Now, a lot of people have said that as a result of that, it's very unfun. I find that to be terribly fun.
Different strokes for different folks. Well, that's going to do it for our Mega Rankings now. We're going to transition the show a little bit differently here, and we're going to do a wrap-up and then what we would play, because we're going to have Spencer actually leave in a clip. Spencer wanted to leave what he would play and talk about that for a second. So, before we get on to what we would play, Trey, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at TreyMC. It's probably the best way to communicate with me.
Awesome. You can find me at Mason E. Clark on Twitter. You can find me at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. And then you can find Spencer at Spencer13H on Twitter and at CCMTG on Twitch. And then you can follow the show on Twitter at CCMTG. And you go to patreon.com/CCMTG. You go on Patreon. We have the Patreon only group where we talk about decks and discuss stuff. And, we'll write articles and deck tech and stuff like that. I wrote a 15,000 word article on Modern when I thought going into this past weekend. And I believe all the decks I put in, I had at them as S and A tier instead of 1 and 2. Or the decks we just talked about minus Amulet Titan. I put it as a 0 tier deck or F tier deck. And that's just kind of a cool thing that you have access to. And eventually one day that stuff might become public, but at that point it might be a little bit less relevant to the current metagame. But if you like the show and you want to give back, there's cool things that we are doing to give back. And we're still always trying to improve the Patreon. So if you have the Patreons, if you have cool ideas, send them our way. Now, Trey, what would you play for any SCGs, GPs, MCQs, since MCQs are starting up this weekend? For Modern, we're just going to talk about Modern since Standard is kind of going into the sunset period, starting up this weekend. For Modern, we're just going to talk about Modern since Standard is kind of going into the sunset period.
I will be gacking people until they ban it. I can't see any reason to do anything else. It's absurd.
Just hard Hogak. If you're there to win the tournament and you're there to play the most efficient deck possible, you're saying the GAC is back. Absolutely.
It is crazy consistent. It's extremely powerful, and the edges that you get from your opponents playing scared as soon as you go fetch Blood Crypt Faithless Looting, the joy drains from their eyes, and then they start making bad decisions. And it's the deck that I think that you should be playing.
Yep. So it's hard for me to say you shouldn't play Hogak. I might not be playing Hogak partially because of card availability. I just kind of refuse to buy into it because I think it's going to get banned. If it doesn't get banned, I think that's because the metagame's adapted to it. There is one good thing I think about Hogak, and that it does kind of push out some of the more nonsense decks of the format, and because of Hogak's existence, I think decks like Neobrand, etc. just can't really exist, so you can play decks like Blue-White Control and Jund more. If I wasn't going to play Hogak, and I was going to have to suggest a deck to play, I would suggest the following decks in this order for decks to play. I would suggest Urza, Jund, and Blue-White Control. I think Urza is the deck that is actually closest to Hogak when it comes to power level. It just hasn't been figured out yet, and I think getting in now is a great thing, a great opportunity. I think your deck also plays in a very weird and unique way, kind of like Hogak, and you're going to catch people off guard. And while there is some graveyard hate, which is kind of a splash hate for the Thopter combo, you still have Sai and Urza as a way to actually win games. And so while you might lose your combo post board, you still have a lot of really powerful things going on. I think Jund, for similar reasons like we talked about before. I think Blue-White Control, for similar reasons like we talked about before. Just going to be able to answer all these things and try and attack the metagame and be able... They're just going to be less nonsense decks that were beating you before for those two decks, and I think it's going to rise up because of that. And then if I had to give you a proactive deck to play, I know I said Eldrazi might have been the better humans. I can't, in good faith, say to pick and not pick humans if that's true, because I think humans beats Eldrazi still. I think it still has a reasonable game against all these decks, even though people think that's not true anymore because of Karn Great Creator. I don't buy that adding Karn still. I think it still has a reasonable game against all these decks, even though people think that's not true anymore because of Karn Great Creator. I don't buy that adding Karn the Great Creator to your deck actually helps you against humans. That card actively hurt you as Amulet Titan, and we were much better at playing that card. So that's kind of where I'm at with Modern right now. We're going to have Spencer have his clip here right now, but thank you everyone so much for listening to the show. Make sure to listen to Spencer's clip right quick here, and we'll see you all next week.
Everybody, Spencer here. I just wanted to apologize for missing the episode this week, but I'm really excited to talk to you about the decks that I would consider playing this week in Magic. So, I am currently focused on Modern, as we have GP Vegas coming up, Modern season coming up, and one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is how I want to approach Modern differently this time around. One of my hardest formats over the last couple of years since being a dad has been Modern, and one of the reasons for that is just how many decks there have been to keep up with. There's so many decks. The format actually kind of changes a lot. It changes almost month to month or every couple months, and that's really hard to deal with when you don't play a ton of competitive Modern because, well, one, you don't play weekly Modern at your weekly events, and even if you did, that's not really that competitive when you think about going to Grand Prix, you think about playing PTQs. And then, you don't play a ton of MTGO just because you don't have mana traders, you can't switch decks a lot. And kind of thinking about how I wanted to approach the next Modern season, I kind of wanted to just lock in on a deck that I thought could be good and that I could tune for my expected meta. And so that left me with the choices of Blue Eye Control and Jund. Now, you might ask yourself, like, Spencer really likes something along the lines of Titan Shift. Isn't that a deck that you can tune for an expected meta? And while the answer is yes, and I do think that, there's 3 different versions of Titan Shift that you could try and play between Breach Titan, Titan Shift, and Bring to Light Titan, or Bring to Light Shift. I just really don't think that Volca decks are in the right place right now, but that doesn't mean that I don't have them in my back pocket. And Blue Eye Control is what I've been playing in Modern for quite a while. It's a deck that I think has eggs into going into this current Modern season. I'm going to be mostly playing Jund, and the reason for that is because I think Jund has gotten some really interesting cards in the last couple of weeks, or months I should say, and it has the ability to grind out games and win matches that it shouldn't have before. One of the matchups that I think that has become in Jund's favor that wasn't is actually just Blue Eye Control. I think that Blue Eye Control has been slightly favored in the past, and I think Ren 6 plus some of the other things that Jund has gotten has made Jund good. And then across the board, I think matchups are really similar between Blue Eye Control and Jund. So if I think that Blue Eye Control is good, I think that Jund is just a better version of that. And I think that you see a lot of Blue Eye Control players coming to that conclusion and considering picking up Jund again. Because while Blue Eye Control is a quote-unquote control deck, Jund is, kind of a faster clock version of that deck that has interaction in a different way. I really like where Jund could be positioned if you build the deck in certain ways, and it's a deck that I'm going to be trying out. As far as standard, a quote-unquote control deck, Jund is, kind of a faster clock version of that deck that has interaction in a different way. I really like where Jund could be positioned if you build the deck in certain ways, and it's a deck that I'm going to be trying out. As far as standard goes, I'm really looking to try out a couple of different things. One of the things that I'm really considering trying out that maybe I'll post something in the Constructed Critics group is actually mono red elementals or green red elemental aggro, just as an aggressive beatdown elemental deck that utilizes a couple of different cards that I'm excited about. So kind of stay tuned for that. That's a deck that I'll be trying out here after the